For 15 days, an elderly woman lived in silence, being humiliated and neglected inside her own home. Controlled by her daughter-in-law, she faced hunger, isolation, and the pain of becoming invisible. But everything changes when an unexpected arrival reveals what no one dared to tell. What is discovered within those walls changes not just one life, but the meaning of an entire story. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The fine May afternoon rain fell over Chicago with a quiet persistence that seemed to want to wash the entire city clean. Mrs. Helen watched from the bus window as the streets glistened, hurried Chicagoans scurrying under colorful umbrellas, the trees swaying in the chilly wind that announced winter was on its way. At 73, she carried only an old floral print fabric suitcase in her hands and a confusing mixture of relief and apprehension in her heart. She was leaving behind the simple house where she had lived for 40 years, the neighborhood where she knew every neighbor by name, the quiet routine of afternoons on the porch, and the conversations with Mrs. Lewis, her friend of several decades. All of this would now be kept only in her memory because Michael, her only son, had insisted so much that she could no longer resist. Michael had always been a determined boy. Ever since he was little, when his father was still alive, he showed that iron will to succeed in life, to build something greater than what they had. Helen fondly remembered the nights he studied late, illuminated only by the faint light of a desk lamp, while she sewed clothes for others to supplement their tight budget. The effort paid off. Michael graduated with a business degree, got a job at a multinational corporation, rose quickly through the ranks, and at 38 was already a regional director for one of the country's largest tech companies. He married Frances, an elegant and well-educated woman he met at a corporate event, and together they built a life Helen had never imagined possible for her son. The mansion was in a gated community in the Willow Creek Estates area, surrounded by manicured gardens and high walls that guaranteed privacy and security. Helen had only visited the place twice before agreeing to move in. The first time, she was enchanted by the spaciousness of the rooms, the marble floors that reflected the sunlight, the heated pool in the back, and the impeccable decor that Frances commanded with refined taste. But she had also felt a certain discomfort, as if that space wasn't made for someone like her, a simple woman who had spent her whole life wearing flip-flops indoors and making coffee with a cloth filter. It was after Helen had a fall at home, slipping in the wet bathroom on a Sunday morning, that Michael became truly worried. Although nothing was broken, the situation raised an alarm. He started calling every day, sometimes twice a day, asking how she was, if she needed anything, if it wasn't better to have someone nearby. Helen said she was fine, that her neighbor Mrs. Lewis always stopped by, that she was careful, but Michael wasn't convinced. Until one April afternoon, he showed up at her house unannounced, accompanied by Frances, and said in that firm voice that accepted no argument, "Mum, you're going to live with us. This isn't a request, it's a decision." Helen tried to argue. She said she didn't want to be a bother, that she was used to her routine, that it would be hard to adapt. But Michael was relentless. He spoke of the spacious room that would be hers, the balcony overlooking the garden, the maid who would take care of everything, the peace of mind he would have knowing she was safe. Frances beside him smiled and nodded, saying it would be a pleasure to have her mother-in-law close, that the house was too big for just the two of them, that she would love the company. Helen looked at her son and saw so much love in his eyes, so much sincerity, so much need to protect her, that she couldn't refuse. 2 weeks later, she was packing her bags. When the bus stopped at the station, Michael was already there waiting. He was wearing a dark suit even though it was a Saturday, because he had come straight from a last-minute meeting. He hugged his mother tightly, took her suitcase and said that Frances was at home preparing lunch. During the car ride, Helen observed the city that would now be hers. Chicago was different from the small town where she was born and raised. Here everything seemed faster, more modern, more impersonal. But Michael spoke excitedly about the parks she could visit, the doctors he had already scheduled for a full checkup, the convenience of having everything nearby, The mansion was even more beautiful than Helen remembered. Frances greeted her with a delicate hug and a perfect smile, wearing a beige outfit that matched the living room decor. She led Helen to the room that would be hers, a large space with a king-size bed, a mirrored wardrobe, a reading chair by the window, and a private bathroom with a bathtub. Everything smelled of lavender. Everything was impeccably tidy. Helen thanked her but felt like an intruder in a museum. Frances told her to make herself at home, that the house was hers now too, and went downstairs to finish preparing lunch. The first week passed quietly, almost monotonously. Helen woke up early, as she always had. But the silence of the house was strange. There were none of the familiar neighborhood sounds, the church bell, the bread seller shouting in the street. Here, everything was muffled, isolated, protected. She had breakfast alone in the enormous kitchen, served by Jessica, the middle-aged housekeeper who had worked there for 5 years. Jessica was a woman of few words, efficient and discreet, who cared for the house with silent dedication. Helen tried to make conversation, asking about her family, offering to help with some task, but Jessica always maintained a respectful distance, as if there were an invisible line. That should not be crossed. Michael left for work early and came back late. Frances had her own routine: the gym in the morning, lunches with friends, spa sessions, meetings for the charity club of which she was vice president. Helen spent her afternoons alone, wandering through the rooms of the house, trying to find her place in a space that didn't seem made for her. She would sit on the balcony and watch Oswald the gardener tending to the plants with almost religious attention. He was a man in his 50s, with sun-darkened skin and hands calloused from working the earth. Unlike Jessica, Oswald had a more welcoming demeanor. When he saw Helen on the balcony, he would nod and sometimes comment on the weather or the flowers that were about to bloom. Dinners were the only times the family gathered. They sat at the large dining room table served by Jessica, and Michael would talk about his work, the company's challenges, the trips he would have to take. Frances would listen with interest, ask intelligent questions, and show knowledge of corporate affairs. Helen tried to follow along, but she often felt lost in those conversations about markets, strategies, and targets. When Michael asked how her day had been, Helen would say that everything was fine, that she had rested, that the house was beautiful. She didn't want to worry him with the loneliness she felt, or the sensation of being a piece that didn't fit into that perfect puzzle. It was in the second week that Michael announced his trip, an international conference in London, an important opportunity to close strategic partnerships. He would be away for 15 days, maybe a little longer if negotiations extended. Helen saw the worry on her son's face and immediately said she would be fine, that Frances was there, that he shouldn't miss this opportunity because of her. Frances, beside him, touched her husband's arm and said in a soft voice that she would take care of everything, that Mrs. Helen was in good hands, that he could travel without worry. Michael relaxed, thanked his wife with a kiss on the forehead, and promised his mother he would call every day. The morning Michael left, Helen felt a tightness in her chest she couldn't explain. She said goodbye to him at the door, received a tight hug, and watched the car disappear. Through the community gate, she went back inside the house and noticed the silence seemed heavier, more oppressive. Frances was in the living room scrolling through her phone, and when Helen passed by, she looked up and smiled. But there was something different about that smile, something Helen couldn't identify at that moment, something that seemed too cold to be genuine. The first day without Michael was strange, but still bearable. Frances left in the morning for her usual activities and returned in the late afternoon. Dinner was served normally, the conversation was polite, everything seemed to be in order. But on the second day, small changes began to appear. Frances didn't come down for breakfast. Helen ate alone with Jessica, who seemed more tense than usual. When she asked if everything was all right, Jessica just nodded quickly and went back to work. At lunch, Helen noticed the food was different. Not that it was bad, but it was simpler, less carefully prepared than usual. Jessica served some rice, beans, and stewed chicken that seemed to have been made in a hurry. Helen ate without complaining, said thank you, and went back to her room. In the afternoon, when she came down for tea, she found Frances in the living room, impeccably dressed, talking on the phone with someone. When she saw her mother-in-law, Frances interrupted the conversation and said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Do you need something?" Helen said she just wanted some tea, but Frances replied curtly that Jessica was busy and that she could make it herself, since the kitchen was at her disposal. The tone was polite, but it carried a coldness Helen had never heard before. She mumbled an apology, went to the kitchen and prepared her own tea. Jessica was there washing dishes with quick, nervous movements. When Helen entered, the housekeeper lowered her head and continued working in silence. Helen felt that something had changed, but she didn't know exactly what. In the following days, the change became increasingly evident. Frances started to control everything. She told Helen it wasn't necessary to come down for breakfast so early, that she could have it in her room. She controlled meal times, deciding when Helen should eat, and often the portions were smaller than normal. The food began to have a strange smell, as if it had been stored for two, long or reheated several times. Helen tried to eat, but her stomach churned. When she discreetly mentioned it to Jessica, the housekeeper averted her gaze and said that was what had been prepared. Frances also began to control Helen's medications. She said it was to organize them better, to ensure she didn't get confused with the doses. She locked all the medicines in a cabinet and started giving them to her personally, at times she determined. Sometimes she was late, sometimes she forgot, and when Helen reminded her, Frances would respond impatiently that she was busy with more important things. Helen tried to call Michael a few times, but Frances always appeared at the moment of the call. She would stay nearby, listening to everything, and Helen, embarrassed, would end up just saying that everything was fine, that she missed him, that he should enjoy his trip. Michael, on the other end, seemed satisfied to know his mother was being well cared for. He would thank Frances for taking such good care of everything and say he would be back soon. It was in the second week that the situation worsened drastically. Frances began to speak harshly to Helen always, when no one else was around. She said she was a burden, that she was disrupting the house's routine, that she should stay in her room more so as not to get in the way. Helen, shocked, tried to understand what she had done wrong, but Frances would just turn her back and walk away, leaving her alone with her confusion and pain. Jessica watched everything, but remained silent. Helen noticed the housekeeper's pitying gaze, but she also saw the fear. Frances ruled the house with an iron fist, threatening to fire anyone who disobeyed her orders. Jessica had 3 children to support on her own and couldn't afford to lose her job. So she lowered her head and obeyed, even when the orders included serving Helen food that was clearly not fit for consumption. Oswald, the gardener, also noticed the changes. He had a habit of working in the front gardens in the morning and the back in the afternoon. From her bedroom window, Helen would sometimes watch him pruning the plants, watering the flowers, talking softly to the birds that landed on the branches. One day, while Helen was sitting on the back porch trying to get some sun, Oswald passed by and stopped to arrange a flower pot. Without looking directly at her, he murmured softly, "Are you all right, ma'am?" Helen felt her eyes well up, but she just nodded yes, afraid that Frances might be watching from a window. That night, Helen found a small folded note under the flower pot on the porch table. She opened it with trembling hands and read the words written in neat handwriting. "We see what's happening. You are not alone." There was no signature, but Helen knew immediately it was from Oswald. That small gesture brought a sliver of comfort to her heavy heart. At least someone noticed what was happening. At least she wasn't completely invisible. But the note, however comforting, didn't change reality. Helen remained trapped in that cycle of humiliation and neglect. Frances became more aggressive in her words each day, more cruel in her actions. She controlled when Helen could leave her room, forbade her from moving around the house at certain times, and told her she was getting confused, that she was imagining things, that perhaps she needed psychiatric help. Helen felt weakened not just in body, but especially in spirit. She began to doubt herself, to question if she really was imagining things, if she wasn't being a burden to everyone. The bad food, reheated and often sour, that she was served daily made her stomach sick, but she forced herself to eat something to keep from fainting. The smell of spoiled food clung to her nostrils, her clothes, her memory. Jessica, whenever she could, would cast apologetic glances at Helen. At times, when Frances wasn't around, she would leave a glass of fresh water by the elderly woman's bed, or fluff her pillows with extra care. But she couldn't do more than that. The fear of losing her job, of not being able to support her children, of facing the consequences of defying Frances, was greater than her desire to help. Oswald continued to leave hidden notes. One day, Helen found another inside a book on her bedroom shelf. "Have faith, this will pass." And another days later, hidden among the leaves of a plant, "Someone will see the truth." Those messages were the only thread of hope Helen could cling to in the most difficult moments, when Frances humiliated her, or when her stomach ached from hunger and spoiled food. She remembered the notes and tried to maintain her dignity. Frances also began to spread malicious comments among the staff. She said that Mrs. Helen was losing her memory, that she made up stories, that she complained about everything for no reason. She tried to undermine the elderly woman's credibility bit by bit, building a narrative in which she was the confused and ungrateful villain, and Frances was the patient and dedicated daughter-in-law who endured it all with resignation. When Michael called, Frances always answered first. She would say her mother-in-law was resting, that she had taken her medicine and gone to bed. Hurley, that everything was under control. When she finally passed the phone to Helen, she would stay close, monitoring every word. Helen, sensing the surveillance, didn't have the courage to tell the truth. She would say everything was fine, that she missed him, that she was taking care of her health. On the other end of the line, Michael would be reassured, relieved to know his mother was in good company. The nights were the worst. Helen would lie in the huge, comfortable bed, but couldn't sleep. Her stomach ached, her head spun, her heart was heavy. She thought of the simple house she had left behind, the afternoons with Mrs. Lewis, the freedom to come and go without asking permission. She thought of her son, and how devastated he would be if he knew what was happening. But she didn't have the strength to tell him. She didn't want to worry him, didn't want to ruin his trip, didn't want to be the cause of a fight between him and his wife. The 15 days of Michael's trip seemed endless. Each new morning was another battle to be faced. Helen would wake up not knowing what the day would bring, but always expecting the worst. And she was rarely disappointed. Frances had become relentless, treating her mother-in-law like an inconvenient object that needed to be kept hidden and quiet. Jessica and Oswald, each in their own way, tried to offer small gestures of solidarity. Jessica, when she could, would leave fresh fruit hidden in Helen's room. Oswald continued with the notes, and whenever he crossed paths with the elderly woman, offered a discreet smile of encouragement. But these small gestures, though comforting, were not enough to change the oppressive reality Helen was living. She felt increasingly weak, more faded, more invisible. The mansion that was supposed to be a refuge had turned into a silent prison, and Frances, the cruel warden who controlled every aspect of that prison. Helen looked out her bedroom window and saw the world outside carrying on as normal. People coming and going, cars passing, birds flying free in the sky. And there she was, trapped between marble walls and lies, waiting for someone at some point to see beyond the perfect facade that Frances had built. On the 14th day of Michael's trip, Helen woke up weaker than ever. She could barely get out of bed. Her body ached, her head spun, her stomach churned at the mere thought of food. When Jessica entered the room to open the curtains, she found the elderly woman pale and trembling. She asked if she was all right, but Helen just shook her head, unable to speak. Jessica ran downstairs to tell Frances, but her employer just shrugged and said it was drama, that Mrs. Helen was used to seeking attention, that it was nothing serious. She ordered Jessica to take breakfast to the room and let the old woman rest. Jessica obeyed, but as she went up with the tray, her face wore the expression of someone carrying an unbearable weight of guilt and helplessness. Helen looked at the plate Jessica placed on the small table and felt like crying. It was stale bread, reheated coffee that tasted sour, and a piece of overripe fruit. But she was so hungry that she tried to eat it anyway. Each bite was an immense effort, each sip a sacrifice. Jessica stood there for a moment, watching the scene with teary eyes, before leaving in silence. Downstairs in the kitchen, Oswald came in to get some water. He saw Jessica sitting on a chair, her face in her hands. He approached slowly and asked what had happened. Jessica, between stifled sobs, told him that Mrs. Helen was very ill, that she couldn't take it anymore, but that she didn't know what to do. Oswald squeezed her shoulder in a gesture of solidarity and said that maybe it was time for someone to do something before it was too late. That afternoon, while Frances was out for another of her social engagements, Oswald left one last note for Helen. This time he didn't hide it. He placed it directly on the nightstand beside the bed where she would surely see it. The message was short but full of hope. "He's coming back tomorrow. Hold on." Helen read the note and felt a tear run down her wrinkled cheek. Tomorrow Michael would be back. Tomorrow everything could change. Or maybe not. Maybe she wouldn't have the courage to tell him. Maybe she would remain trapped in that cycle, that pain, that silent humiliation. But at least, for one more day, she would hold on, because it was all she had left to do. Night fell over Chicago and Helen closed her eyes in the large empty bed, praying softly for her son to return soon, for someone to see beyond the perfect mask Frances wore, for the truth to come out before it was too late. And while the city slept outside, inside that silent mansion, an elderly woman fought not to disappear completely, clinging to a fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, would be enough to survive until dawn. Michael's flight landed at O'Hare International Airport on a Friday morning, 3 hours earlier than scheduled. He didn't tell Frances about the change in time, wanting to surprise her, and perhaps get home in time to have lunch with his mother. The trip had been productive, contracts signed, partnerships secured, but during those 15 days, he had felt an unease he couldn't explain. Whenever he called home, the conversations with his mother seemed too short, too superficial. Helen said everything was fine, but there was something in her voice that sounded different, faded, tired. Frances assured him she was taking care of everything, that her mother-in-law was great, that he didn't need to worry. But the unease remained, growing with each day he was away from home. In the taxi from the airport to the gated community, Michael looked at the familiar Chicago landscape with relief. He was anxious to hug his mother, to see that she was well, to confirm that all his worries were just a product of distance and missing her. He arrived at the community around 11:30 in the morning. The security guard at the gate was surprised to see him at that hour, but opened the gate with a welcoming smile. Michael thanked him, grabbed his suitcase, and walked to the house, smelling the scent of the trees still damp from the previous night's rain. The front door was unlocked. He entered silently, truly wanting to surprise Frances and his mother. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful, welcoming silence he expected. It was a heavy, almost suffocating silence. He left his suitcase by the entrance and walked towards the dining room, from where he could hear the faint clatter of dishes. What he saw upon entering the room left him frozen. Mrs. Helen was sitting at the table, hunched over a plate that exuded a strange, unpleasant smell. She held a fork with trembling hands, trying to bring a piece of something Michael couldn't immediately identify to her mouth. But what struck him most was the expression on his mother's face, a vacant, distant look of someone who had given up fighting. She seemed smaller, more fragile, more faded than when he had left. Her clothes were loose on her body, her face paler, her eyes sunken and dull. "Mum," he said, and his voice came out louder than he intended. Helen looked up, startled, as if she had been caught doing something wrong. The fork slipped from her hand and clattered onto the plate. "Michael," she whispered, and a single tear traced a path down her wrinkled face. Before he could say anything, Frances appeared from the kitchen. She was wearing a casual but elegant dress, her hair in a perfect bun, and she held a dish towel in her hands. Upon seeing her husband, she froze for a second, and Michael noticed a flicker of something that could have been shock or fear in her eyes. But the expression was quickly replaced by a broad smile. "Honey, you're home early. Why didn't you tell me? I would have picked you up from the airport." Michael didn't answer right away. His eyes went back to his mother's plate, and then he walked to the table. The smell grew stronger as he got closer. It was the smell of old food, reheated several times, mixed together without care. He looked at the plate and saw a grayish mass that seemed to be rice, beans, and some kind of meat, all mashed together, covered in a sauce of dubious color. "What is this?" he asked, pointing to the plate. Frances shrugged, maintaining her smile. "It's your mother's lunch. We had leftovers from yesterday, so I made use of them to not be wasteful." Michael felt something tighten in his chest. He carefully picked up the plate and sniffed it. The odor was unmistakable. Spoiled food. He looked at his mother, who averted her gaze, and then at Frances, who was starting to look uncomfortable. "My mother was eating this?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Frances crossed her arms. "Michael, you're overreacting. It's just leftovers. Your mother is from a generation that didn't waste anything. She said herself she preferred it this way." Helen shook her head weakly but said nothing. Michael saw the gesture and felt anger begin to rise in his throat. He put the plate back on the table and said firmly, "Mom, come with me, let's go to your room." He helped Helen stand up, and only then did he realize how much weight she had lost. Her bones protruded under her clothes, her arms were thin and frail. She leaned on him with difficulty, as if each step required immense effort. Frances tried to say something, but Michael cut her off with a cold stare. "We'll talk later," he said, and it wasn't a request. In Helen's room, Michael helped his mother sit in the armchair by the window. He knelt in front of her and held her hands in his. They were cold, trembling. "Mom, what's going on here? Please tell me the truth." Helen looked at her son and saw so much concern in his eyes, so much love, that she felt the barrier she had built over those 15 days begin to crack. But the fear was still strong, the fear of causing trouble, of destroying her son's marriage, of being seen as the mother-in-law who created a mess. "Everything's fine, son," she murmured. "I'm just a little tired." Michael squeezed her hands tighter. "Mom, you've lost so much weight, you're pale, weak, and that plate downstairs, and that wasn't proper food for anyone, let alone you. Please tell me what happened while I was away." Helen opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The tears came first, silent and heavy. Michael hugged his mother, feeling her body tremble in his arms. And in that embrace, without her needing to say a word, he understood that something very wrong had happened there. After a few minutes, when Helen had calmed down a bit, Michael went to the kitchen. Frances was there scrolling, on her phone with a tense expression. When he entered, she tried to smile again. "Honey, I think you're tired from the trip. Maybe you misinterpreted the situation." Michael opened the refrigerator without a word. What he saw shocked him. Plates covered with dirty cloths, packages that had been open for days, moldy leftovers, a mix of foods that looked more like garbage than a meal. The smell coming from it was nauseating. He started pulling out the containers, placing them on the counter. Frances tried to intervene, but he ignored her. Jessica entered the kitchen at that moment, coming from the utility area. When she saw the scene, she stopped at the door, her face pale. Michael looked at her. "Jessica, has this been served to my mother?" The housekeeper glanced at Frances, who shot her a warning look, but Michael caught the exchange. "Jessica," he repeated more firmly, "I'm asking you a question. Has this been served to my mother?" Jessica lowered her head and in a trembling voice replied, "Mr. Michael, I only do what I'm told." That sentence said it all. Michael felt his legs weaken. He looked at Frances, whose face was now red, her eyes shining with restrained anger. "Do you have any explanation for this?" he asked, his voice low but charged with emotion. Frances tried to maintain her composure. "Michael, you don't understand. Your mother is very demanding. She complains about everything. I tried to do my best, but she always finds reasons not to like things. So I thought since she came from a simple life, maybe she'd prefer more basic leftover foods." The excuse was so absurd that Michael could hardly believe what he was hearing. "Spoiled food isn't basic food, Frances. This is neglect. This is—" He paused, searching for the right word. "This is cruelty." Frances took a step forward, trying to touch his arm, but Michael pulled away. "You're being unfair to me. I took care of her for 15 days. You have no idea how hard it is to deal with an elderly person, with their quirks, their complaints." Michael held up his hand, silencing her. "I don't want to hear any more right now. I'm going to take care of my mother. We'll talk later." He left the kitchen, leaving Frances alone with excuses no one wanted to hear anymore. He returned to Helen's room and found his mother still sitting in the armchair, looking out the window. He knelt beside her again. "Mom, from now on everything is going to change. I'm going to find out exactly what happened here, and I'm going to make sure you never have to go through this again." Helen looked at her son and saw in him the same determination he had as a boy when he promised that one day he would give her a better life. And for the first time in 15 days, she felt a flicker of hope. In the hours that followed, Michael acted quickly. He took his mother for a complete medical examination. The doctor confirmed dehydration, mild malnutrition, and signs of intense emotional stress. Michael listened to the diagnosis with a heavy heart, the guilt weighing on his shoulders. He had left his mother there, trusting she would be safe, and in just 15 days she had been reduced to this state. Back at the house, Michael called Jessica for a private conversation in his office. The housekeeper entered with red eyes, clearly nervous. He asked her to sit and said gently, "Jessica, I'm not going to blame you for anything, but I need you to tell me everything that happened while I was away. Everything. And I promise you won't lose your job for telling me the truth." Jessica hesitated for a few seconds, but seeing the sincerity in Michael's eyes, she broke down. She told him how Francis had changed completely after he left, about the bad meals, the deliberately served reheated and spoiled food, the controlled schedules, the delayed medication, the verbal humiliation, the threats to the staff. She also told him about the fear she felt, how Francis manipulated everything to make it seem like Mrs. Helen was confused or complaining, and she told him about Oswald, who left hidden notes for the elderly woman, trying to offer some comfort. Michael listened to it all in silence, his face growing darker. When Jessica finished, he thanked her with a choked voice and said she had done the right thing by telling him. Then he called Oswald. The gardener confirmed everything Jessica had said and showed him some of the notes he had written. Michael held the crumpled pieces of paper and felt his eyes burn. Those small gestures of kindness had been the only light in the darkness his mother had faced. That night, Michael couldn't sleep, lying in the guest room bed because he couldn't bear the thought of sharing a room with Francis at that moment. He thought about everything he had discovered. The woman he had married, the woman he loved or thought he loved, had revealed herself to be a completely different person. And worse, he hadn't noticed the signs. He had been so consumed with work, so confident that everything was fine, that he had ignored the small clues that had perhaps always been there. The next day, Michael made a decision. He needed concrete proof, not just testimonies. He needed to see with his own eyes what really happened when he wasn't there. So, discreetly, he installed small security cameras in strategic points of the house: the kitchen, the dining room, the hallway near his mother's room. They were modern, almost invisible cameras that recorded audio and video. He didn't tell anyone, not even Helen. He wanted the routine to continue as normally as possible. Over the weekend, Michael feigned normality. He spent time with his mother, took her for a walk in the park, and prepared homemade, nutritious meals. Helen began to regain some color in her face, the sparkle in her eyes. Frances, for her part, maintained a polite distance. She tried to get closer to her husband, but he responded with monosyllables and coldness. On Monday, Michael announced he had to go back to the office to sort out matters from his trip. Francis seemed to relax a little at the news. When he left in the morning, he kissed his mother's forehead and said softly, "Trust me." From his office, Michael accessed the cameras on his computer. He had an important meeting in the morning, but between tasks, he checked the footage. At first, everything seemed normal. Francis had breakfast alone, Jessica cleaned the house, Oswald tended the garden. But around 11 o'clock, when Francis went to take lunch to Helen in her room, Michael saw something that made his blood run cold. The hallway camera captured Francis entering the room with a tray. Michael activated the audio and heard his wife say in a sweet, false voice, "I brought your lunch, Mrs. Helen. I hope you like it." Then her voice changed completely. As soon as she closed the door, Francis sneered with contempt. "Though, I doubt you even deserve this. You're nothing but a burden in this house, you know that. Just sitting there, being dramatic, complaining about everything. If it were up to me, I would have sent you back to that hole you came from." Michael clenched his fists, trembling with rage. He kept watching. He saw his mother try to say something, but Francis cut her off. "Don't even bother opening your mouth. No one believes a confused old woman like you. Michael trusts me, not someone who's already losing her mind." The cruelty in her words was shocking. Michael felt the urge to run out of the office, go home, and confront Francis right then and there. But he restrained himself. He needed to see more, gather more evidence, understand the full extent of it all. In the following days, the recordings revealed a terrifying pattern. Francis treated Helen with contempt whenever they were alone. She served reheated food, threatened Jessica when the housekeeper tried to improve the meals, and managed her mother-in-law's medication irregularly. In one recording, Michael saw Francis throwing away fresh fruit that Jessica had set aside for Helen and replacing it with overripe pieces. But the most shocking discovery came when Michael also decided to investigate the household finances. He had always trusted Francis to manage the domestic expenses, as she had insisted on taking on that responsibility shortly after their wedding. Upon reviewing the bank statements from the last few months, Michael noticed strange transactions. Large sums were being transferred to an account he didn't recognize. Investigating further, he discovered that the account belonged to Francis, a personal account she had kept secret. The amounts added up to a considerable sum. Francis had been systematically siphoning money from the household, disguising the transactions as various expenses for maintenance, shopping, and services. Michael felt betrayed on every possible front. It wasn't just the cruelty to his mother. It was also the financial dishonesty, the manipulation, the complete sham his marriage had turned out to be. He spent the week gathering everything: recordings, bank statements, written testimonies from Jessica and Oswald. He discreetly consulted a lawyer who confirmed he had more than enough evidence for any legal action he wished to take. But before making any legal decisions, Michael knew he had to confront Francis. Not for her, but for himself. He needed to understand how he had married someone capable of all this. On Friday night, after a full week of silent investigation, Michael came home with a folder of documents. He found Francis in the living room watching television and asked her to join him in the office. Francis, suspecting nothing, obeyed. When he closed the office door behind them, Michael placed the folder on the desk and looked at his wife. She smiled, trying to maintain the facade, but something in his eyes made her realize this would not be an ordinary conversation. "We need to talk about what happened to my mother. While I was away," he began, his voice calm but firm. Francis sighed as if tired of repeating the same story. "Michael, we've already talked about this. I did the best I could. Your mother is difficult to deal with, and—" Michael opened the folder and took out printed photographs from the security cameras. He placed them on the desk, one by one, in silence. Francis looked at the images and turned pale. They were frames from the recordings, her serving spoiled food, her speaking with an expression of contempt, her threatening Jessica. "Michael," she began, but her voice failed. He then turned on the computer and played a few clips from the audio recordings. Francis's voice echoed through the office, cruel and cold, saying horrible things to Helen. When the video ended, the silence was deafening. Francis tried to speak, but Michael held up his hand. "I'm not finished." He then took the bank statements from the folder and placed them on top of the photos. "Do you want to explain these transfers too?" Francis looked at the papers and realized she was cornered. All the masks, all the excuses, all the lies crumbled in that instant. She tried to use tears, the last weapon she had left. She began to cry, saying she was stressed, that she couldn't handle the pressure, that she had made mistakes, but that she loved him. Michael looked at her and felt nothing but disappointment. "I want you to pack your things and leave this house, by tomorrow morning at the latest." Francis stood up from the chair, desperate. "Michael, please, we can talk. We can work this out. I know I was wrong, but I can change. I swear I can change." Michael shook his head. "There's nothing left to work out. You humiliated my mother. You stole from me. You lied about everything. There's no coming back from this." Francis tried to approach him, but he took a step back. Her eyes, once filled with pleading tears, changed. The mask fell completely, and all that remained was rage. "You'll regret this," she said in a sharp voice. I'll tell everyone you're kicking me out because of a paranoid old woman. Michael remained calm. You can tell them whatever you want. I have proof of everything, and I'm sure my lawyer will be happy to present it wherever necessary. Frances realized she had lost. She stormed out of the office, slamming the door. Michael stood there, alone, looking out the window at the garden. He felt exhausted, betrayed, but also relieved. For the first time in weeks, he felt he was doing the right thing. Upstairs, Helen was in her room when she heard the muffled shouts coming from the office. Jessica appeared at the door with an expression that said she knew something big was happening. The two women looked at each other, no words needed. The truth, finally, had come to light, and as Frances packed her bags in her room, defeated and furious, the entire mansion seemed to breathe differently, as if a heavy, toxic cloud was finally dissipating, making way for the light to stream through the windows again. Saturday morning dawned with a clear sky over Chicago, and for the first time in weeks, sunlight entered the mansion's windows unobstructed. Michael woke up early, having barely slept, and went downstairs to make coffee. He found Jessica already in the kitchen, cleaning everything with meticulous care, as if erasing the traces of all that had happened there. She looked at him with an expression of relief, mixed with concern. "Good morning, Mr. Michael," she said softly. "Good morning, Jessica. How is my mother?" "Still sleeping. I went up to check on her a little while ago. She seems more peaceful." Michael nodded and poured himself a coffee. Around 8 o'clock, Frances came down with 2 large suitcases. Her face was swollen, her eyes red, but her expression was hard, closed off. She stopped at the kitchen entrance and looked at Michael with a mixture of defiance and hurt. "I came to say goodbye," she said, her voice laced with bitter sarcasm. Michael placed his cup on the counter and faced his wife or ex-wife, since the separation was inevitable. He said nothing, just waited. Frances took a few steps into the kitchen. "You know you're going to be alone, right? Who's going to take care of you? Who's going to organize this house? Who's going to maintain this perfect life you've built?" Michael took a deep breath before answering. "I'll take care of my mother and myself. And this perfect life you mentioned was never so perfect, was it?" Frances laughed, but it was a joyless laugh. "You think your mother is going to be happy here. She never fit in. She was always an intruder in this house." "No, Frances," Michael corrected firmly. "You made her feel that way. My mother was never an intruder. You were the one who didn't want her here." Frances opened her mouth to reply, but was interrupted by Helen's voice from the staircase. "You don't need to fight because of me, son." Michael turned and saw his mother slowly descending the steps, leaning on the railing. She was wearing a simple robe, and her white hair was loose, framing a tired but serene face. He went to her and offered his arm for support. "Mom, you don't need to come down now." Helen shook her head. "Yes, I do. I need to see this through to the end." The two women faced each other. Frances, always so impeccable and controlled, now seemed small and defeated before the elderly woman she had tried to destroy. Helen, for her part, maintained a dignity that no humiliation had managed to completely erase. "I forgive you, Frances," Helen said softly, and the words echoed through the kitchen like silent thunder. Frances was paralyzed. She hadn't expected forgiveness. She had expected anger, accusations, revenge, but forgiveness was something that completely disarmed her. "I forgive you because holding on to resentment only hurts the one who holds it," Helen continued. "But forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean what you did wasn't serious. It was very serious." Frances lowered her eyes for the first time. A genuine tear, unlike the many false ones she had shed, ran down her face. But she said nothing. She picked up her suitcases, looked one last time at Michael, who remained impassive, and walked out the door without looking back. The sound of her car driving away was heard shortly after, and then the house fell silent. Jessica, who had watched everything from the pantry doorway, let out a long sigh. Oswald, who had come in through the back door to get some tools, stopped when he saw the scene. Michael looked at the three of them, his mother, Jessica, and Oswald, and felt for the first time that this house could truly be a home. In the following weeks, the mansion underwent a complete transformation. Michael took a vacation from work to dedicate himself entirely to his mother's recovery, and the reorganization of the house. The first order of business was to overhaul the entire food routine. He personally went to the grocery store with Helen, letting her choose the foods she liked, the brands she knew, the spices she remembered from her childhood. The kitchen, once a territory rigidly controlled by Francis, became a space of experimentation and affection. Jessica was given total freedom to cook with creativity and love. Michael increased her salary and made it clear that she was not just an employee, but an important part of the household. Jessica, for the first time in years, felt valued and respected. She began to prepare dishes that Mrs. Helen loved: fluffy rice, well-seasoned beans, roasted chicken with potatoes, homemade soups that filled the house with comforting aromas. Helen gradually regained her weight and color. Follow-up medical exams showed significant improvement. But more important than her physical recovery was the emotional one. She began to smile again, to talk, to show interest in the world around her. Michael spent hours sitting with her on the porch, listening to stories from the past, learning about the simple life she had lived before, about his father, about the struggles and joys of a time he only knew from photographs. Oswald also took on a new role in the house's dynamic. Michael discovered that he was not only a skilled gardener, but also had knowledge of carpentry and small repairs. He entrusted him with the mission of creating a special garden in the backyard, a space designed especially for Helen. Oswald accepted the challenge with enthusiasm. For weeks, Oswald worked on that garden. He planted roses, jasmine, lavender, and other flowers Helen had mentioned she liked. He created a small stone path, installed wooden benches under the shade of a tree, put in a bird bath, and even built a small pergola covered in climbing vines. Jessica helped in her free time, planting aromatic herbs in a side garden. Michael, whenever he could, worked alongside them, getting his hands dirty, learning about the plants, and rediscovering the simplicity that corporate life had stolen from him. Helen watched everything from her bedroom window, moved by the care everyone was taking, but what touched her most was the transformation in her own son. Michael seemed to have slowed down, to be more present, more attentive to the small details that make a difference. He prepared breakfast for her, sat at the table to talk without rushing, asked about her dreams, her memories, her plans. For the first time, Helen felt that her son wasn't just fulfilling a duty, but genuinely wanted to be there. One day, while they were having coffee on the porch, Michael held his mother's hand and said, "Mom, I need to apologize. I'm sorry for not realizing what was happening. I'm sorry for blindly trusting Francis. I'm sorry for putting my work above everything else. You suffered because of my negligence." Helen squeezed her son's hand. "Son, you didn't know, and I didn't have the courage to tell you either. We have to forgive each other." Michael felt his eyes burn. "I promise that from now on it will be different. I promise I'll be present, that I'll listen to you, that I'll never let something like this happen again. I know, son. I trust you." That moment sealed a new phase in the relationship between mother and son. It was no longer a relationship based on duty and obligation, but on genuine love and a conscious choice to be together. The house was also physically renovated. Michael hired painters to freshen up the walls, replaced the heavy curtains with lighter ones. That let the light in, and rearranged the furniture to create cozier spaces. Helen's room got a complete makeover, a new coat of paint in soft tones, more comfortable furniture, an antique radio Michael found at an antique shop that played the music she loved. Jessica and Oswald, once just fearful employees, became confidants and friends. They had lunch together at the kitchen table, talked about life, and shared laughs and worries. Oswald revealed he had a daughter studying nursing, and Michael offered to help pay for her education. Jessica told him about her dream of one day opening a small boarding house, and Michael promised to help her when the time came. The dynamic of the house changed completely. Mornings began with the smell of fresh coffee and homemade bread. Jessica would play music in the kitchen while preparing breakfast, and Oswald would come in through the back, whistling a country song. Helen would come down to the table and be greeted with genuine smiles and affectionate conversation. Michael, whenever possible, worked from home, setting up his office in a room that was previously used only for storage. Afternoons were dedicated to the garden. When it was finished, Oswald insisted on presenting it to Helen personally. He led her along the stone path, showing her every flower, every bench, every detail designed especially for her. Helen couldn't hold back her tears, seeing so much beauty and love translated into plants and stones. "This garden is the heart of this house now," Oswald said with pride, "and you, ma'am, are the one who gives it life." Helen began to visit the garden every day. She would sit on the benches in the shade, listen to the birds sing and watch the butterflies dance among the flowers. Sometimes she would bring a book. Sometimes she would just close her eyes and let the sun warm her face. Michael often joined her, and there they would talk about everything, about the past, the present, dreams, and regrets. It was during one of these afternoon conversations that Michael shared an idea that had been maturing in his mind. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I realized that you weren't the only one to go through something like this. There are so many elderly people who suffer in silence, who are neglected, forgotten, mistreated, and I want to do something about it." Helen looked at her son with curiosity. "What do you have in mind?" Michael took a deep breath. "I want to create an institution, a place that welcomes vulnerable elderly people, a place where they are treated with dignity, respect, and affection, where no one goes hungry, where no one is humiliated, where every person is seen and valued." Helen felt her chest tighten with emotion. "Son, that's beautiful, but it's a big project." "I know," Michael agreed, "but I have the resources, I have the time, and now I have a purpose. You taught me that. Professional success means nothing if it's not accompanied by humanity. I want to use everything I've built to make a difference in the lives of people who need it." Helen hugged her son tightly. "I'm so proud of you, my son. So proud." Michael began working on the project immediately. He consulted with experts in gerontology, social workers, and architects specializing in accessible spaces. He visited existing institutions, talked with elderly residents, and listened to stories of suffering and resilience. Each account reinforced his determination. The land for the institution was purchased in a quiet Chicago neighborhood near a park, and well served by public transportation. The architectural design was thought out to the smallest detail: spacious and comfortable rooms, common areas, therapeutic gardens, a kitchen equipped to prepare nutritious and tasty meals, a library, an activity room, and an ecumenical chapel. Everything was designed to make the elderly feel at home, not in a cold, impersonal institution. Helen followed everything closely, offering suggestions based on her own experience. She advised on which colors were more welcoming, what type of furniture was more comfortable, and which activities would make a difference in daily life. Michael listened to every word attentively, recognizing, in his mother, a wisdom that only experience and suffering could bring. During the months of construction, life in the mansion continued at its new pace. Michael drastically reduced his work travel, delegated more responsibilities at the company, and prioritized being present at home. He discovered that he could be an efficient executive without sacrificing his personal life, that he could have professional success without losing sight of what truly mattered. Jessica and Oswald became fundamental pillars of this new dynamic. The housekeeper began to cook, not only for the family, but also to teach Helen some modern recipes she didn't know. The two spent hours in the kitchen, laughing, talking, and creating bonds that went far beyond an employer-employee relationship. Oswald, in turn, taught Helen about gardening. She learned how to care for the plants, prune the flowers, and recognize when they needed water or fertilizer. The house, once silent and oppressive, filled with life. There was always music playing, conversations in the kitchen, laughter on the porch. The smell was no longer of spoiled food, but of fresh bread, freshly brewed coffee, and flowers from the garden. The rooms that once seemed empty and cold gained personality and warmth. Michael also began to receive visits from friends he hadn't seen in a long time. He introduced his mother with pride, showed off the garden, and talked about the institution project. Helen, once invisible, had become the center of that house, the person around whom everything revolved. And she flourished in that environment, regaining not only her physical health, but most importantly, her self-esteem and joy for life. There were difficult moments during that period of rebuilding. Michael went through the divorce process, which was painful and complicated. Francis tried to negotiate, asked for another chance, and threatened lawsuits. But Michael stood firm. He presented the evidence he had, and her lawyer advised her to accept the proposed terms without creating more trouble. The separation was finalized a few months later, and Michael felt freed from a weight he didn't even know he was carrying. Helen also had difficult moments. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night with nightmares, reliving the 15 days of suffering. Michael would hear her crying softly and go to her room, sit on the edge of the bed and hold her hand until the fear passed. Gradually, with time, and all the love she received, the nightmares became less frequent until they disappeared completely. The institution project moved forward. The building began to take shape, and Michael carefully chose the name, Helena House, in honor of his mother. When he told her, Helen cried with emotion. She had never imagined that the suffering she had endured could be transformed into something so beautiful and meaningful. The institution's staff was selected rigorously. Michael and Helen participated in the interviews, choosing caregivers, nurses, cooks, and social workers who demonstrated not only technical competence, but, above all, empathy and a calling to care for the elderly. Each team member was trained to see the future residents as unique individuals with stories, desires, and dignity. Oswald was invited to take care of the institution's gardens. He accepted with joy, seeing it as an opportunity to do something even greater. He began planning sensory gardens, community vegetable patches, and green spaces where the elderly could reconnect with nature. Jessica was offered the position of kitchen coordinator at Helena House. She would be responsible for training the team, developing nutritious and tasty menus, and ensuring that every meal was prepared with care. She hesitated, torn, between her loyalty to the family she had grown to love and the opportunity for professional growth. Michael reassured her, "You will always have a place here at home, Jessica. But this is an incredible opportunity, and I know you will do a wonderful job there, and maybe we can find someone to help here, someone you can train and trust yourself." Jessica accepted, moved, and together they found a young woman named Rita, Jessica's niece, who was just starting her career and brought the same dedication and affection as her aunt. The inauguration of Helena House was scheduled for a Saturday in September, when spring was beginning to paint Chicago with color. Michael woke up that day with a mixture of anxiety and joy. Everything he had worked for over the past few months would finally come to fruition. He went down to the kitchen and found Helen already awake, having coffee with Rita. "Good morning, my son. Big day today," Helen said with a smile. "Big day, Mom. Are you ready?" "I always have been." The opening ceremony was simple but emotional. Local officials, project partners, future residents and their families, as well as friends of Michael and Helen were present. Jessica and Oswald were there, proud to be part of it all. Michael gave a short speech, thanking everyone and explaining the project's origin. Then he invited Helen to cut the inaugural ribbon. Helen, with trembling but steady hands, held the scissors and cut the red ribbon. Applause echoed through the institution's garden, and the doors were opened. Visitors entered and explored the spaces, admired the gardens, and talked with the staff. The first residents, some already present, looked around with expressions of hope and relief. They finally had a place where they would be cared for, with dignity. In the late afternoon, after everyone had left, Michael and Helen sat on a bench in the garden of Helena House. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and pink. Oswald was watering the plants in the distance, whistling softly. Jessica passed by, talking with Rita about preparations for the residents' first dinner. Michael looked at his mother and saw tears in her eyes. "Are those happy tears?" he asked. Helen nodded. "They're tears of gratitude, son. Gratitude because even after so much pain, God gave us the chance to turn it all into something beautiful, to make a difference." Michael hugged his mother. "And none of this would have happened if it weren't for you. You taught me what really matters in life. You taught me about resilience, about forgiveness, about true love." Helen rested her head on her son's shoulder. "We never know why we go through the things we do we? But sometimes in the end, we understand that everything had a purpose." They sat there in silence, watching the sun disappear over the horizon. Helena House would begin full operation on Monday, and many lives would be transformed there. But at that moment, at the end of that special Saturday, mother and son were simply grateful for the journey, for having found each other again, and for having the courage to start over. The mansion in Chicago, once a scene of pain and humiliation, had transformed into a true home. And from that home, a project was born that would bring hope to so many others. The garden that Oswald had created with such care continued to flourish, a perfect symbol that even after the worst storms, life always finds a way to begin again, to bloom anew, stronger and more beautiful than before. 2 years had passed since the inauguration of Helena House, and the Chicago autumn painted the streets with yellowed leaves that danced in the wind. The institution had become a benchmark in the care of vulnerable elderly people, not just in the city but throughout the state of Illinois. What had begun as a dream born from pain had transformed into a reality that touched dozens of lives daily. Michael arrived at Helena House on a Tuesday morning, as he did at least 3 times a week. He didn't come just as the founder or administrator, but as someone who genuinely cared about every person who lived there. He knew the residents by name, knew their stories, remembered their birthdays, and participated in the small celebrations that marked the daily life of that special place. The entrance to the institution was always welcoming. Fresh flowers adorned the hall, soft music played in the background, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the kitchen. Mrs. Clarice, one of the first residents, was sitting in an armchair near the window, crocheting. When she saw Michael, her wrinkled face lit up with a smile. "Good morning, Doctor." "Michael," she said, using the affectionate title she insisted on giving him, even though she knew he wasn't a doctor. "Good morning, Mrs. Clarice. How did you sleep?" "Like an angel, thank God. And I dreamed of my daughter. She was beautiful in the dream, all in white." Michael sat beside her for a few minutes, listening about the dream, about the memories it brought back. He knew Mrs. Clarice hadn't seen her daughter in years, ever since the family had drifted apart due to problems she preferred not to detail. At Helena House, however, she had found a new family. The other residents, the caregivers, the people who treated her with the respect and affection she deserved. Jessica appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray of still warm homemade cookies. She distributed them among the residents in the living room, chatting with each one, asking about their preferences for lunch. She had blossomed in her role as coordinator, bringing to the institutional kitchen the same care and affection she once dedicated to Michael's family. Her team worked with admirable dedication, preparing meals that were true declarations of love in the form of food. Oswald was in the gardens, as always. He had expanded the original project, creating different themed spaces: a sensory garden with aromatic plants, an orchard with fruit trees adapted to the region's climate, and a community vegetable patch where residents with mobility and interest could plant and harvest their own herbs and vegetables. He taught about the plants with infinite patience, sharing knowledge accumulated over decades of working with the earth. That morning, Oswald was helping Mr. Anthony, an 82-year-old man who had discovered a new passion in gardening. The two were discussing the best time to plant basil, and Oswald demonstrated pruning techniques while Mr. Anthony watched attentively, asking questions and jotting everything down in a worn-out notebook. Michael watched the scene from the window and felt gratitude tighten his chest. This was exactly what he had imagined when he dreamed of Helena House, a place where elderly people were not just cared for, but seen, valued, and encouraged to continue living with purpose and dignity. The institution's routine was carefully planned, but flexible enough to respect individualities. There were set times for meals, group activities, and moments of leisure and rest, but no one was forced to participate in anything. Those who preferred to stay in their room reading had that freedom. Those who wanted to spend the entire day in the garden could do so. The staff was always attentive but not intrusive, respecting the autonomy and choices of each resident. The activities offered were varied: reading groups, craft classes, movie sessions, a choir, adapted ballroom dancing, yoga for seniors, physical therapy, and memory workshops. There was also individual and group psychological support, essential for many who carried traumas and losses. One of the most successful initiatives was the Life Stories program. Once a week, a volunteer would sit with a resident and record their story, their childhood, loves, losses, jobs, dreams fulfilled, and those left behind. These recordings were transcribed and turned into small books that were kept in the Helena House Library. Many residents found in this process a way to give meaning to their own journeys, to feel important, to leave a legacy. Michael participated in these recording sessions whenever he could. Each story touched him deeply, reminding him that behind every wrinkled face was a lifetime of experiences, wisdom, and humanity. "I've learned more about life listening to these stories than in all my years of college and career," he used to say. That afternoon, a small party was planned. Mrs. Teresa was turning 85, and the team had organized a celebration in the common room. Jessica had prepared a special chocolate cake with strawberries, the birthday girl's favorite. The decorations were simple but made with care. Colorful balloons, a happy birthday banner made by the residents themselves in a craft workshop, and flowers from Oswald's garden adorning the tables. Helen arrived at Helena House in the middle of the afternoon, brought by Rita, who now worked part-time at the mansion and part-time helping at the institution. At 75, Helen's health was stable and her spirit more alive than ever. She had become a sort of godmother to Helena House, visiting regularly, talking with the residents, and offering companionship and emotional support. When she entered the common room, she was greeted with smiles and hugs. The residents adored her. They saw in her someone who understood what it was to be elderly, who didn't speak with condescension or pity, but with respect and genuine connection. Helen greeted everyone, stopped to chat with each one, and asked about their aches, their joys, their plans for the week. Mrs. Teresa, the birthday girl, hugged Helen tightly. "I'm so glad you came. The party wouldn't be complete without you." Helen smiled. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. 85 years, you are a warrior." "I'm a survivor," Mrs. Teresa corrected with a twinkle in her eye. "And thanks to this place, I'm living the best years of my life." The words moved Helen, who needed a few seconds to regain her composure. She knew exactly what Mrs. Teresa meant. She understood the difference between merely surviving and truly living with dignity. The party was joyful and emotional. They sang happy birthday, ate cake, and listened to Mrs. Teresa tell stories from her youth. Some residents danced to the sound of old songs playing on an old radio. Michael danced with his mother, then with Mrs. Clarice, and then with Mrs. Teresa. Oswald played the guitar, revealing a talent few knew he had, and everyone sang along to songs that had marked generations. When the party ended and the residents began to retreat for dinner, Michael and Helen sat on a bench in the garden. The sun was starting to set and the temperature was dropping with the approaching night. Oswald passed by carrying tools back to the shed and waved to them with a knowing smile. "This place is beautiful, son," Helen said, looking around. "You've realized a beautiful dream." "We realized it, Mum. None of this would exist if it weren't for you." Helen shook her head. "I think everything happens for a reason. Those terrible 15 days I went through. At the time, I thought I wouldn't survive. But look what it turned into. Look how many lives are being touched because of it." Michael held his mother's hand. "You taught me that pain can be transformed into purpose, that suffering doesn't have to be the end of the story, but can be the beginning of something greater. And you taught me that it's never too late to start over, son, that even when all seems lost, there is always hope." They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the shadows lengthen across the garden. A bird landed on the bird bath Oswald had installed and drank peacefully. In the distance, they could hear the voices of residents chatting in the dining room, the clatter of dishes being prepared in the kitchen, life going on its normal, beautiful course within that institution. Michael thought about everything that had changed since that day. He returned from his trip and found his mother before a plate of unfit food. He thought of Frances, who had moved on with her life in another city and with whom he no longer had any contact. He held no grudge against her, only a distant sadness for all that could have been different. He thought of the career he had restructured to have more balance, the trips he had reduced, the priorities he had redefined. His professional life was still successful, but now it had a greater meaning. Michael used his business success to fund not only Helena House, but also other social projects related to elderly care. He gave lectures at universities, wrote articles on the importance of public policies for seniors, and became an active voice in discussions about the dignity and rights of the elderly. But what fulfilled him most were not the awards Helena House had received, nor the public recognition of his work. It was being able to sit there, in that garden, next to his mother, knowing he had done the right thing. It was seeing Mrs. Clarice's smile when she received a visit from a niece she hadn't seen in years. It was watching Mr. Anthony harvest tomatoes he had planted himself. It was hearing Mrs. Teresa say she was living the best years of her life. Helen broke the silence. "Son, there's something I never told you." Michael looked at her, curious. "What is it, Mum?" "During those 15 days when everything was so difficult, I thought a lot about your father. I remembered how he always said you would be a good man, a man who would make a difference in the world. At the time I thought he was, referring to professional success, but now I understand he was talking about something else. He was talking about kindness, about empathy, about using your talents to help others." Michael felt his eyes burn. "I wish he were here to see all this." "I think he is seeing it, son. From somewhere he's watching and he's proud." An employee came out of the institution and waved to them. "Mrs. Helen, Mr. Michael, dinner is served. Would you like to join us?" Michael looked at his mother, who nodded with a smile. They rose from the bench and walked hand in hand towards the building. The light from the windows illuminated their path, and the smell of home-cooked food welcomed them warmly. During dinner, they sat at the large table with the residents. Jessica served the meal with her usual care: fluffy rice, seasoned beans, roasted chicken with vegetables, fresh salad. Everything prepared with love and attention. The conversation flowed lively, with jokes, laughter, and shared stories. There was no rigid hierarchy between staff, residents, and visitors. They were all simply people sharing a meal, an experience, a community. After dinner, some residents went to the TV room to watch a soap, opera. Others preferred to play dominoes or cards. Mrs. Clarice invited Helen to teach her a crochet stitch, and the two sat at a table near the window, needles in hand, chatting softly as they worked. Michael took the opportunity to make his rounds through the institution, checking if everything was in order. He passed by the rooms, greeting those who were still awake. He checked the kitchen, where Jessica and her team were cleaning up with quiet efficiency. He checked the gardens, where Oswald was watering the last plants before leaving. Every corner of that place carried stories, memories, life. On his way back to the common room, Michael stopped in front of a wall where photographs of the residents over time were displayed. There were pictures of parties, garden activities, everyday moments. In all of them, he saw genuine smiles, lively eyes, people who had regained their dignity and joy for life. One photo in particular caught his attention. It was from the inauguration 2 years earlier. In it, Helen was cutting the red ribbon with an expression of hope and determination. Beside her, Michael was smiling proudly, and in the background, out of focus but present, were Jessica, Oswald, and the first residents of Helena House. That image perfectly captured the beginning of a journey that had transformed so many lives. When it was time to go home, Michael and Helen said goodbye to everyone. Hugs were exchanged, promises to return were made, and good nights echoed through the hallways. Rita was waiting in the car to take them back to the mansion. During the drive, Helen looked out the window at the streets of Chicago, illuminated by the lampposts. The city continued its nightly rhythm, indifferent to the small silent revolutions happening in places like Helena House. But for those who lived and worked there, every day was a revolution of love, care, and respect. When they arrived home, the mansion greeted them with its completely transformed atmosphere. It was no longer the stage of pain and humiliation it had been 2 years before. It was a true home, full of light, good memories, and hope. The walls held laughter, deep conversations, shared plans. The backyard garden, created by Oswald and now maintained by a young gardener he had trained, continued to flourish, a perfect symbol of rebirth. Michael prepared tea for his mother before bed, as he did every night. They sat on the back porch, wrapped in light blankets to protect them from the evening chill, and sipped their tea in contemplative silence. "Son," Helen said after a few minutes, "I want you to know something. These last 2 years have been the happiest of my life, not despite everything that happened, but in a way because of it, because all of that taught us what really matters. It taught us not to take love, presence, and dignity for granted. It taught us that we can choose what to do with our pain." Michael put his cup aside and held his mother's hands. "I'm happier now too, Mom. I learned that success without purpose is empty, that true relationships are worth more than any professional achievement, that simplicity and presence are greater luxuries than any mansion." Helen smiled. "Your father would say you've finally grown up." Michael laughed. "Yeah, I think he'd be right." They sat there until the tea grew cold, talking about plans for the future. Helena House was planning to expand, opening a second unit in another part of the city. Michael was negotiating partnerships with universities to create internship programs for students of nursing, social work, and gerontology. Helen was thinking of writing a book about her story, hoping it could help others going through similar situations. The dreams were many, but they all shared the same purpose: to make a difference, to touch lives, to spread a little of the light they themselves had found in the midst of darkness. When they finally retired for the night, Michael stopped by his mother's room to say goodnight. Helen was already in bed, her face peaceful against the pillow, a rosary between her fingers. "Good night, Mom. Sleep well." "Good night, my son. Thank you for everything." "I'm the one who's thankful, Mom, for everything." Michael closed the door softly and went to his own room. He lay in bed and looked at the ceiling, thinking about the entire journey that had brought them to this point. He thought about how much life can change in a short time, how choices define destinies, how love and determination could transform tragedy into purpose. Sleep came easily that night, lulled by the certainty of being on the right path, of doing what truly mattered. In the months and years that followed, Helena House continued to grow and touch lives. Stories of transformation multiplied, families reconciled, people who had lost hope found reasons to go on, and at the center of it all was the memory that even the fiercest storms can give way to flourishing gardens, as long as there is the courage to plant seeds of love where once there was only pain. The story of Helen and Michael became an inspiration, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was profoundly human. It spoke of mistakes and successes, of losses and new beginnings, of wounds and healing. It spoke of the capacity we all have to choose what to do with our suffering. Let it destroy us or transform it into something that helps others. And there, in that Chicago mansion, and at the Helena House that was born from pain, mother and son continued to write their story. A story that didn't end with a happy ending, but continued every day, in every gesture of care, in every word of comfort, in every life touched by love and dignity. The garden that Oswald had created years before continued to flourish. New flowers were born each spring, trees grew strong and healthy, birds made nests in the branches, and in that garden, among petals and leaves that danced in the wind, lived the proof that life always finds a way to begin again, to bloom anew, stronger and more beautiful than before. As long as one has the courage to see the truth, as long as one has the humility to admit mistakes, as long as one has the strength to forgive, and above all, as long as one has enough love to choose light over darkness, forgiveness over resentment, purpose over bitterness. This is the story of Helen and Michael. A story of pain that transformed into healing, of humiliation that generated dignity, of abandonment that created community, of darkness that gave way to light. And like all the best stories, this one has no definite end. It continues every day in each resident of Helena House who wakes up knowing they will be treated with respect. In every meal prepared with love by Jessica, in every flower planted by Oswald, in every hug exchanged, every smile shared, every moment of true human connection. The Chicago mansion remains standing, no longer as a symbol of empty success, but as a true home, where love and purpose dwell. And Helena House continues to open its doors to those in need, offering not just shelter and care, but above all, dignity and hope. Because in the end, that is what we all seek, to be seen, to be valued, to be loved. No matter our age, no matter our condition, no matter our past, we all deserve to live with dignity until our last day. And this is the lesson that Helen taught her son, and that together they taught the world, that it is never too late to start over, that it is never too late to make a difference, that it is never too late to choose love. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Helen and Michael has touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of pain, forgiveness, and new beginnings, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what part of this story resonated with you the most. Was it Helen's courage, Michael's transformation, the garden that symbolizes rebirth? We want to know what touched your soul. Every day we bring intense stories like this one which reveal the deepest and truest side of the human experience. Stories that make us reflect on dignity, love, family, and the capacity we all have to transform pain into purpose. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another narrative that will move and inspire. Until then, take care of those you love and remember, it's never too late to start over.